Welcome to Exceptionally Speaking, the podcast where we explore how to better understand and support exceptional learners. I'm Dr. Meryl, and each week I sit down with dedicated educators, parents, and advocates to share real strategies, inspiring stories, and moments of hope. If you're enjoying these conversations or learning something new, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, I'm truly honored to welcome Dr. Susan Assouline to the podcast. This is a conversation I've been especially excited about because her contributions have shaped so much of what we do in gifted education today, and they've directly influenced my own practice and deep interest in academic acceleration. Dr. Assouline is the University of Iowa Emeritus Blank Endowed Chair in Gifted Education, a distinguished professor of school psychology, and the Emeritus Director of the Belin-Blank Center for Gifted Education and Talent Development. Throughout her career, her research and advocacy have reflected the center's mission to develop potential and inspire excellence, and her work has been enriched through the collaboration with colleagues across the field. Her journey began as a middle school science teacher before she pursued graduate studies in educational psychology at the University of Iowa. That path led her to the Belin-Blank Center, where she served as school psychologist, associate director, and ultimately as director and endowed chair. Dr. Assouline has been at the forefront of research on acceleration, shaping acceleration decision-making tools such as the Iowa Acceleration Scale and the Integrated Acceleration System. She also co-authored the landmark reports A Nation Deceived and A Nation Empowered, both of which are available right now to download for free. These works fundamentally changed how educators understand and approach acceleration for gifted students, and I highly recommend checking them out. Her leadership, scholarship, and mentorship have left a lasting mark on the field, and I feel incredibly fortunate to have had this conversation with her, and I'm thrilled to share it with you. You can find more information about the Belin-Blank Center and how to download A Nation Deceived and A Nation Empowered at hex24press.com. Please enjoy Exceptionally Speaking with Dr. Susan Assouline. Hey, Susan, it's so good to see you. Thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Meryl. I'm really happy to be here, and it's always great to see you.
I am super excited for this conversation. Really an honor to talk to you again and to share our conversation with others. And I'd love to just start at the beginning. What really drew you into educational psychology in the first place? And then how did you end up in gifted education?
Well, first of all, let me say likewise. It's really an honor to talk to you because it's very energizing to talk to professionals like yourself who are always pushing the edge and trying different things. And I've learned a lot from you. So I appreciate this opportunity. I started out a long time ago as a classroom teacher and started teaching science to middle school students. I'm really passionate about middle school for a variety of reasons. But when I started, there weren't very many women who were science teachers. So I always I think in my own way, I like to push the edge. But also when I started, I was a regular education teacher teaching science to middle school students. But special education, especially the area of learning disabilities, that's what it was just called back then, learning disabilities, not specific learning disabilities, had just really gotten started as a field. And so all of my close friends were special ed teachers. And the unique thing about that is that I had students in my class who clearly were struggling, but I hadn't learned anything about how to work with struggling students, when I was involved in my professional development. And so I kind of listened to what they were doing. And then I thought, oh, well, this would be kind of cool. Maybe I'll just start taking some classes since I was living in Iowa City at the time and the university was literally just down the street. So I just started taking classes and I was really drawn to special education and to all of the things involved in that. And one of the first classes I took was a class on students who were intellectually disabled. And coincidentally, the textbook was one that had been authored by Hal and Nancy Robinson. So I really came full circle decades later when Nancy presented at a conference that we hosted early in the 2000s about twice exceptional students. I brought my book and asked her to sign it. And so it was very awesome for me. So that's kind of the shortened version as to how I got involved in that.
That's so interesting. Okay, I didn't know you had started as a science teacher.
Mhm.
We always say
blessings to the middle school teachers because that's such a hard age and but so important to their development. So
Well,
how did
I
you
say blessings to kindergarten teachers and primary teachers. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I could not do that."
Yeah, it's a whole different world. It's so interesting to see how the approach to instruction has to be so different across the
Mhm.
wide span. So we need so many different types of people and people with different strengths to enter those areas. I'm wondering how you actually got connected with Belin-Blank Center and how you ended up as director there for so long.
Well, so lucky me, I was a grad student, but working at the same time. So I was taking classes in the evening, and you know how that goes. I'm sure you've had the same thing where you did that. But in the summers, I was fortunate enough to have a graduate assistantship. And one of the classes I took early in my studies was a class from Nicholas Colangelo. And it was a class that he'd been teaching called Foundations of Counseling. So it had nothing to do with gifted. It was all about counseling. And that was something that I needed for my graduate program. But he was doing something in the summers that was pretty unique. He was involved in bringing teachers. It just started out in 1980. The first cohort came in 1981, but where they had really generous philanthropists in Des Moines, Iowa, Mike and Jackie Blank, and David and Connie Bellin. And they made a cold call to Nick. The true story is that they had made a cold call to another university in Des Moines that rhymes with Drake and suggested that they had some funding that they'd like to give to them if they could do something, if they had a good idea. And they said no.
Wow.
Nick had just finished New Voices in Counseling the Gifted, and Connie Bellin was on the State Board of Regents. And she was very curious about all kinds of things, like really curious. And the State Board of Regents had to approve professors who were hired by the university. And so she had seen that he had written this voice called New Voices in Counseling the Gifted, which was an edited book. And so it was one of the first things out there. So she called young Nicholas Colangelo and said, "Can you come to Des Moines and talk about any ideas that you might have if we give a small amount of money to the University of Iowa for some type of summer programs?" And his idea, which I loved and I would still maintain needs to be a very important avenue, is that, well, let's work with classroom teachers because classroom teachers touch minimum 30 kids. I mean, I touched 150 kids every day. And
Mhm.
if we work with the classroom teachers, and they did an intensive in residence program. In those days, it was 3 weeks. I like to say now people are much smarter, and they are because there's a lot more knowledge out there. It's still going strong today, 45 years later, but it is 1 week. So Dr. Colangelo, part of the funding that he had for this program is all teachers came, they lived in the residence hall, they spent 3 weeks there. And it really touched what I was interested in, which was working to a certain extent with classroom teachers to help them be better prepared to work with kids. And if you help classroom teachers better understand gifted kids, it doesn't matter whether they've been identified for a program. There were very few programs back then, but he needed a graduate assistant. And so I applied to be the graduate assistant. And it was really fun because as a graduate assistant, somebody with a teaching background, I really connected with those teachers and I just so enjoyed it. And so I kept taking classes. I was interested in becoming a school psychologist, which is what I did first. And then I went on to get my doctorate in educational psychology. But I continued to be really interested in gifted education based upon that 3 week experience. And then I continued as a graduate assistant for him. And I was one of a few graduate assistants that he had. So that's how I got involved in gifted ed. You know, it's like chance. As we all know, chance is very important. And if I hadn't had the chance opportunity to take classes, and I hadn't had the chance to make the choice to take classes, and then my area of interest just was shaped by the professors that I had. And so He was a critical mentor and then eventually became a colleague. When I went to do a postdoc at the study of mathematically precocious youth at Johns Hopkins University with Dr. Julian Stanley, and that increased my world and led me to other people. And then I made a happy move back to the University of Iowa 1990, 2 years after the Belin-Blank Center had been established. And I
Okay.
started out as their school psychologist, but then became the associate director about a year into it. And then I served as associate director until the director position became available. And I applied and I became the director and the endowed chair. So that was what I did the last 10 years of my career.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And so interesting just to see how the Belin-Blank Center has grown and continued to
Yeah.
support families and educators in support of gifted education. I'm wondering too for listeners if you could just explain a little what the Belin-Blank Center does currently in support of students.
So the Belin-Blank Center was established in 1988, and essentially it was at that point in time very focused on professional development for teachers who were already in service. But we received some additional funding in 1988 to establish a program for students. And that was funding that came through the state of Iowa, so it was only for Iowa students. But to have there must have been something magic about 3 weeks, but to have a 3-week program, it was in those days, it was called a Governor's Institute. It has since changed names and changed. It's been through several iterations. But our first programs were the professional development program and that 3-week student program for middle school students that exposed them to different domains of talent development. And I would say that that was kind of maybe the beginning of what one would consider to be a focus on talent development. And so the Belin-Blank Center now, which, as I said, was established in 1988, really took off, in the early 90s as we continued. Lots of things happened federally and statewide that promoted our capability of expanding programming. So one of the first things I was able to do, and that's because the state of Iowa developed an endorsement program. And so I was able to get that endorsement program. Well, to have an endorsement program, you have to have classes. So I developed 2 classes that are still going, Psychology of Giftedness and Assessment of Giftedness. And so that just was the beginning then of getting several people involved in developing classes and workshops. So there's a whole professional development component to the Belin-Blank Center. It's one of the pillars. And then the student programming really evolved as we expanded beyond just having students who would come for a 3-week program where they were totally scholarshiped and only Iowa students. Remember, I had come from the study of mathematically precocious youth, and they're the ones who started the above level testing using the Scholastic Aptitude Test. And that was for middle school students. And so my good colleague and my close colleague, Ann Lubkowski-Shoplik, and I were postdocs at the same time under Julian Stanley. And he got lots of messages because there had been an article in Time magazine for people who were very curious about their mathematically precocious child. And he worked with the students who were in 7th grade and above about what to do. But anybody younger than that, he gave those students to Anne and to me. And
Okay.
so we started using, this was 1988. So we started using an approach where we sent out tests that were above level, and we would send them out. And the principal would have somebody administer them to the student. Then we would send out these long interpretations. And there's a really funny story about it because it was like, we'll score it, and we told the principals that, but this one particular principal we kept going above level and above level with one of the students that he had. I don't even remember the state anymore. And he sent it back to us and he said, "This is beyond my ability to score." And I'm like, "Well, you don't have to score it. We just, we will score it for you." It was just so cute. And so we would write these detailed interpretations of what those scores meant and what that would mean for the students. Well, that was laborious. And so
Hmm.
we decided to experiment with other tests. And remember, I said that I moved back to Iowa in 1990, and that was a very happy move. And so I contacted ACT, and ACT had entered the scenes after the SAT, which was in the very early 80s, and then ACT joined. They became involved with talent searches. That's a whole nother podcast in terms of talent searches, but they became involved in 1985. And so I called a contact that I had at ACT and said, do you all have anything that would be even remotely like a pre-SAT? And they said, well, as a matter of fact, we do. And so they were just rolling out an 8th grade test at that time. And so the goal of that particular suite of assessments was that test was called Explore. And so students would explore, and then like their 10th grade assessment was Plan, and then their college entry assessment was ACT. So
Okay.
Explore, Plan, and Act. And so we experimented with the Explore test, and it became hugely successful. And ACT said, would you mind if we shared this with other talent searches? And we're like, will more kids be able to benefit? And they're like, yeah, of course. I'm like, then share away. And so our student programming expanded because we implemented an academic talent search. And part of that meant then, like, it's part of what I like to refer to as a 4D model. It's not, I didn't invent that, Dr. Stanley did, but you discover, you describe, you develop, and then you disseminate information. So the testing part is the discovery part. And really that stays true to everything that the Belin-Blank Center still does today. Then you get information, like those test scores provide information, especially above level. Then you describe what that information means in terms of the student's talent development. And so then you develop. And then once you know about that, then, as researchers, you write that up and then you disseminate that information. And so that's kind of how our student programming started to grow. And there's a lot more that I could say about it, but if you go to the website, you'll learn a lot more about all of the programs for both teachers and for students. And then I was able to start a clinic. So again, everything starts with like 20 teachers in one group, or 80 students in one group, and then for the clinic, the assessment and counseling clinic, that started with one student at a time. And so that has expanded. And one of my former grad students, Dr. Katie Shabilian, is the supervisor of psychological services. She's a school psychologist. And I still have lots of close colleagues at the Belin-Blank Center, and I'm still involved in some of the research and other things. So, yeah, that's
That's great.
what
Thank you.
happened.
Yeah, I love learning about how it all really came together. And so it really has me thinking about a nation deceived and then a nation empowered. How did those works really come to be? It sounds like part of the work that you were doing ramped up into the potential need to let more people know really what the barriers were around acceleration in our nation, and maybe that some of them weren't true and that we were putting our own barriers up. So I'd love to hear more about how your first text, A Nation Deceived, came to be.
That is a really fun story, and we really had a great time working on that, as was the case 10 years later with A Nation Empowered. But the John Templeton Foundation contacted us and said, if we provide some funding, is there a topic that you think would be important to talk about? And we were well aware, as you know fully, that the research supporting academic acceleration had not, no pun intended, had not kept pace with the implementation in schools. And so that was what we posed as something that needed to be more fully addressed. And the John Templeton Foundation was very interested in talent development, and they remain interested, but they've also gone on to many other things too. It's been 21 years since that report came out. So we got the funding, and we started doing a lot of kind of what you would call surveying what people thought we should do. And we started to come up with an idea ourselves. Coincidentally, right around that time, the funding I think we got in 2003, the publication came out in 2004, Genius Denied. That was authored by Jan Davidson and Laura Vanderkam. And Jan came to Wallace Symposium, and we were on Jan and Bob Davidson's radar. And she came to a Wallace Symposium, and so we met with her, and we have always been very impressed with the Davidson Institute for Talent Development since they first developed. And we liked the way the title grabbed you. Genius
Mhm.
Denied. And so we also worked with a professional writer to help us with the first volume. And I think Templeton would have been happy with the first volume. And I think that would have been sufficient, but we knew that it wasn't enough. So the first volume was written, and we had the very first volume, and then we decided to have an edited volume to back everything up. And I like to say the first one is the colorful one. I mean, truly, the chapters were like one paragraph or maybe one page, but it was very colorful. It was very informative. And volume one of A Nation Deceived remains quite relevant. And we
Mhm.
had the title, A Nation Deceived, How Schools Hold Back America's Brightest Kids. And that was like, people were like, you can't do that. Everybody will hate the title. Everybody will turn away from you. We're like, okay, but we're going to do it. And we just kept going forward with that. And then Nick contacted somebody in Time Magazine, and he was really interested in doing the story. And so we coordinated everything with the story on A Nation Deceived in Time Magazine with when A Nation Deceived came out, the actual publication. And it was in early September 2004. And I'll tell you, we held our breaths because we thought, no, what are people going to say? What are people going to say? And we got, thousands of comments saying, thank you. This has made a huge difference. And so then the Templeton Foundation was interested in us translating volume one into other languages, which we did. And then we built upon that by actually bringing an international cohort of individuals to come to the Wallace Symposium with regard to all of the researchers, et cetera. And many of the people who attend well, it's a research symposium on talent development. And so many of those people were also people who authored chapters in A Nation Deceived. I'll tell you, Meryl, you know this for a fact, the years go by quickly. And so A Nation Deceived we were able to make it available at the first NAGC in 2004, which I believe was in Salt Lake City. We were able to make it available to all of the participants at NAGC.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's so cool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And we were very grateful. And then from there, we kind of went into having a policy handbook,
Mhm.
the first guidelines for establishing policy. And all of these things, I think, really made a difference in the field. We did an anniversary publication in 2018, I believe. And I remember sharing with the person who helped us with that anniversary publication. This was kind of like, well, we thought we were hopping on the train, on the bandwagon, but we were actually really the engine that was driving, I think, academic acceleration. And as you know, I have phenomenal respect for educators like yourself who have done so much to promote academic acceleration for students who are ready for it. And that all kind of harkens back to the very original, one of the first ideas that I had, which was to develop a a survey instrument, if you will, to help people make decisions about
Mhm.
acceleration. It's not a test, but to make decisions. So it was a decision making tool that, as you know, has since evolved into the integrated acceleration system, which is now an online and interactive decision making tool. So, yeah, that was A Nation Deceived. Our first tool for making decisions was published in 1998. That kind of put us on people's radar. And then in 2004, we had A Nation Deceived. And in 2009, we had the first guidelines for making academic acceleration policy. And then, 2014 happened. I don't know where the time goes,
Right.
but like, oh my gosh, it's been 10 years. It's time to update that. And so we decided that we had gone from A Nation Deceived to A Nation Informed, but we were more than informed, we were empowered. So it was A Nation Empowered, how evidence trumps the excuses holding back America's brightest students. And so that came out in 2015. We had Dr. Colangelo involved with that and Dr. Joyce Van Tassel Basca. We had many more chapters, and we broadened our scope to include Europe. And lots more had happened in those years. In 2004, we did have a chapter on twice exceptionality, but in 2015, we had our own research that we could build upon. And of course, we've built upon that even more over, since 2015. So that's how A Nation Empowered came about. So,
Well,
yeah.
thank you for sharing that. I do just want to share an anecdote with you. When I was a gifted teacher, I was an itinerant gifted teacher across several schools, and I was so excited when I got to actually use the Iowa Acceleration Scales, the paper version, for the first time, because I had read about it, I knew about it, but I just hadn't had a student yet who was ready. And so when I actually got to go through the process, it was wonderful. It was a great experience for me as an educator to really lead a team through a decision-making process and to gather all the data and to really talk to the teachers and the student and the family and to conduct the testing required. But the second one I ever did was for a twice exceptional student who was in an affective needs classroom because of some emotional challenges and regulation challenges as a kindergartner and a student of color. And we went through the scales, and she was highly recommended. And so she went from truly having maybe less than 20% of her time outside of her self-contained classroom once they did the full grade acceleration, and she started attending first grade classrooms. She really thrived, and it was way better for her. And she increased her time outside of her self-contained classroom up to 60-70% because we were able to help meet those academic needs while still supporting her in her other ways that she needed support. And so that was a really interesting experience for me, because when I went to the principal of that school and said, hey, I think we need to go through this process to determine if the student they've already been identified as gifted, but they're showing that they're potentially ready for the next grade level. And they told me just straightforward, I don't believe in acceleration. And I said, okay, well, how about we just give it a shot? Well, let's just go through the process. Let's give it a shot. And that process really changed that school leader's whole view of academic acceleration and whole grade acceleration specifically, but the fact that it could be useful for a student who was struggling in other areas, and they hadn't even considered that. So I know there's many, many stories out there like that, but just wanted to tell you that it was a huge experience for changing some very specific students' lives, but also some school leaders and other educators in the process who otherwise may not have been interested at all in considering that for these students. So thank you and for all your colleagues who spent the time to work and develop these tools. And as you already know, in Denver Public Schools, we the integrated acceleration system, the online system, and it's been a really, really wonderful way to assess and really standardize our approach to whole grade acceleration. And so I'll link both of those on our show notes as well. It's absolutely worth exploring, and anyone who knows me has probably heard me talk to them about this way to approach whole grade acceleration, because it really is, it's really the best way to do it. So thank you for that. I do want to talk about
But can I just say
go
something
ahead.
before we go into our actual topic? You, in particular, among all the educators, and I'm not just saying this because you're asking me questions and I'm going to be on this podcast, and I've met fabulous educators who are very, very, very supportive of the process. I always say trust the process, but you've taken that process and you have expanded it with all of the many things that you have developed for parents and for educators to help them understand what it means to be academically accelerated. And we always say we are not promoting acceleration. We're promoting making a good decision about
Mm-hmm.
where the best, most challenging, engaging environment will be, because it's all about academic engagement. You can't learn if you don't have something new to learn and you're not engaged. And if you have other struggles, they need to be addressed, just like the academic engagement needs to be addressed. One doesn't cause the other, and one doesn't fix the other, but you do need to address both of them. And we're good enough as educators to be able to do that, to think more broadly, to hold two thoughts in mind, right? that let's go through the process. It may not be what's recommended. It may not be the best match at this point in time,
Hmm.
especially for some students who are twice exceptional. It just may not be depending upon the exceptionality.
That's the part I think that is easy win and easy argument when I talk to school leaders is to say, hey, we're taking the onus off of you to make this decision. We are going to use this research based tool. We're going to come together as a team. We're going to collect all this information. We're going to share it with the family. And we're going to make a decision as a group on what the data is indicating and how best we can meet the students' needs. Once it's presented in that way, it's pretty hard to say no to, I'd say.
I know. You want to make an objective decision based on data about a very subjective experience for a student. And you want to do your best. And nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody knows. And of course, you can't be your own experiment. Like you can't accelerate and then not accelerate. But you can look at what happened if students were not academically challenged, and that disengagement is always one of the most important things to take into consideration. So, yeah, the way you phrased it is beautiful.
Thank you. Well, we would be remiss, I think, if we didn't bring up one of the most persistent myths around whole grade acceleration is that it's somehow socially harmful. So, would you mind just talking a little bit about what the research says in regard to whole grade acceleration and how it does or does not support social growth for our gifted students?
So, there are many people who have written about this. And some of the best research has come out of the study of mathematically precocious youth, SMPY, which is now housed at Vanderbilt University, has been for many years, many decades, and co-directed by Dr. David Lubinsky and Dr. Camilla Bimbo. And they were also very significantly associated with Dr. Stanley. So with the study of mathematically precocious youth, these are students who were oftentimes mathematically accelerated as well as whole grade accelerated, sometimes more than once, because they were very, very, very talented. And so they have done research on these students. The first cohorts, they've done research on them for a long time. In fact, they've looked at students who were accelerated 50 years ago. So they're like in their 60s. And these students all will say, my only regret is I didn't do it sooner and or I didn't do more. Now, these students were accelerated prior to having a decision-making tool. But I think that that decision-making tool, had it been implemented, we would have seen that would have been like all of the things that were taken into consideration. Other research that they've done out of the study of mathematically precocious youth, and some of it is also just purely anecdotal too, is that students seem to, it's either neutral or they improve in terms of their social emotional development. That doesn't mean that there aren't things to take into consideration. You know, you may have a student who enters kindergarten early, and as a boy or a girl, that student will likely be less developed than their peers. But that time is kind of short lived. And then the other thing, of course, is development happens in different. I mean, there's a reason why the average age for walking is like 9 to 17 months, right? There's a reason why we say, you know, the average age for reading is maybe like 4 years old. That's pretty extreme, but it could be up to 7 years old. Just depends on the development of the student. Same for, you know, first words that are spoken. So I think that the research demonstrates that it does not do harm. At worst, it's neutral. And at best, especially when you have talented educators who want to make sure that that transition process happens appropriately, that transition makes all the difference. And there's always an opportunity for a trial. There are different ways that different schools use it. And so I would just say that, you know, that's what the research says. But in your gut, it makes sense that you would be hesitant. Most teachers, indeed, would be hesitant, or even principals, because they're operating under the assumption that all kids kind of develop the same. And maybe they're also operating under the assumption, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to miss out. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just let's make sure that this is something that is considered all the dimensions that need to be considered when thinking about, is a student ready to move up a grade or even in a content area. And now on the integrated acceleration system, as you know, we have guidelines for how to have the conversation with the student. That was something that didn't exist on the Iowa acceleration scale, but it does exist on the integrated acceleration system. And the research, like now that we have the integrated acceleration system, we can look and see what the students are saying. And they're like, if they're hesitant, it's because they just don't know about it.
Yes. And in my experience, all of the integrated acceleration system licenses we've used so far, I love to go read the reports. And so I always look at the student section part and see what their response is. It's very rare that a student has no hesitancy at all. And so that, like you're saying, that's normal. That is normal. And it's just kind of an unknown when a student's thinking about, what I think I would like to do that, but to be 1,000% sure, that's not usually what we're seeing, and that's okay. And we want to know that from students because, like you're saying, if a student ends up being highly recommended or a good candidate, then within that transition plan, we want to include any type of supports for any hesitancies that that child is having. And so I think the transition period, like you're saying, is huge, and planning for it prior is huge. We've had instances where students would who are starting kindergarten a year early, they start as half days for the first 4 to 8 weeks,
Yeah.
just as
I
a
mean,
slow roll.
exactly. I mean, and even now, kindergartners in general are oftentimes just starting as a slow roll. Schools do so much more to support the transition. And that's one of the reasons why we say, if you are going to do this, don't get swayed by the fact like, oh, if we do this at the beginning of the year, nobody will know the difference. No, 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 no. When a student moves into a school district, for example, what does a parent do? Parent will go meet with the principal, meet with the teachers, introduce the student. Can we have a tour? Is there an ambassador who can take the student around, depending upon the age, et cetera? You want to set those things up. And the receiving teacher, as you know, is so critical that the receiving teacher be part of that decision-making process. If you want to sabotage the process, don't include that teacher and then just put a student in the class. That doesn't make any sense. We want to just use our common sense combined with the evidence about the student's readiness to determine what's the best match for this student. And in many cases, the slow roll will be, and maybe it's already happened, well, they're already accelerated in reading. They're already accelerated in math. Well, if they're really good in reading, then they probably have the type of comprehension that will allow them to do the other things that students would do in the next grade. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we kind of insist on above level assessments so that they would see, my attitude has always been, well, you need an achievement assessment to know what they've learned. And you should really try to hit 90% mastery because you want them to have learned the material. And then you need a general IQ because, the sort of rule of thumb is every standard deviation represents a grade level. So if you have somebody who's at least one standard deviation above average, then that could very well be addressed depending upon the classroom, because most classrooms have quite a range, but maybe not. Maybe you do need to look at other things to see if their needs to be challenged and engaged would be better addressed by moving up another grade. And so
And I think a good point there also that I like to talk to teachers about is, what is the burden on the teacher in order to differentiate appropriately for this student? And so when the burden becomes so high to differentiate for your one or two students who are ready for more, that is another good indication of, hey, let's collect some more data and see if this student is ready for whole grade acceleration.
Right. And if you have one or two, then you can sometimes do things together, especially for subject acceleration like math or reading. You can move them together so that they've got a buddy. And, you want to work things out in terms of the buddy. But there's more that happens in a child's life. Like, for example, a student who starts kindergarten early, maybe they also go have religious education. Well, you may want to keep them with their age peers for something like that. Maybe they're in scouts or something like that. Well, you may want to keep them with their age peers for that. I like to say when I'm giving this presentation, I like to say, let's look around here. Are the majority of people your age? I mean, I resonate with people my age for sure. And we liked the same music for sure, but that's not what it's all about, right? And most of us have friends that vary in age range, by we get to a certain age, plus or minus, 20 years. I still think about some of the young people who I have had the privilege of working with, and I think, I was like 25 when you were born. You never know who you're going to have the opportunity to work with. So that focus on age as a way of, classifying students, get it from a developmental perspective. But for some kids, they need to move beyond.
Yeah. And I wonder too, about our twice exceptional population. And it's hard to make specific recommendations about twice exceptional students as a whole because that's so broad and it's so dependent on what other needs students have. But I'm just wondering, in your work, what would be some considerations when people are moving through a single subject or whole grade acceleration for twice exceptional students that should just be top of mind as you're talking to the group and making those decisions?
Well, single subject has kind of less pressure, I think. And so I always like to sort of start with that. But some of the same things, the basic things that you need to keep in mind for a student who you're not concerned about some other coexisting disorder, et cetera. Same things. You want to have a general IQ, you want to have above level, you want to have achievement. But especially with the IQ, one of the things that we know through working with just in general twice exceptional students, relying on a composite IQ may not be the best approach to knowing what their strengths are. And also relying on some of the things that we know about students who have certain diagnosed disorders, autism spectrum disorder, for example, is a very good example because broadly speaking, many students on the autism spectrum do not have very high verbal skills unless they are very, very strong students. And if you give a general IQ test, you will see that their verbal skills are very high, but their working memory may be lower and their ability to process information is usually significantly lower. Well, so that may result in a composite score that may not have meant that they have reached the threshold even for some gifted education programs. But if you look at their verbal score, they're going to need something more there. And, kind of by the same token, you want to look comprehensively at the student. Let's take a student who has a specific learning difficulty. A student who has a specific learning difficulty, many times that difficulty is related to their ability to write. It may also be connected with their ability to read, but largely it's their ability to write. And there are other things that might be taken into consideration. And for example, their overall development. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is one where a lot of people will say they don't deserve to be in that next class. I mean, I hear, unfortunately, the term deserve more often than I would like to, just simply because I get it. Like, this moving to the right class is not a reward. It's something that means it's a match. But for the student who's twice exceptional, one does need to take the diagnosis into consideration. And we know from our own research that some students who are twice exceptional, especially those who have a specific learning disability, are more likely to need subject acceleration than whole grade acceleration. And that's because the demands on writing are so heavy that they need to be able to have that time to get that done. But, this is the day and age to have any type of disability given technology. It's marvelous, marvelous what technology can do for individuals with disabilities.
Yes. Yes. And I love what you said about the term deserve. And really, this is not a reward. Single subject acceleration is not a reward. And I've unfortunately come into conversations with teachers who would say, if you're behaving well, then you get to go to your upper grade math today. And that's not the approach that we want to take. When we have the data and the students are ready, that is their right to receive that instruction at their level. And so that's why
Exactly.
the transition planning is so necessary. And so we may need to consider what behaviors are happening around and before the actual transition to that other classroom and mitigate for those, knowing that the student is still going to get the instruction that they're ready for. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
The integrated acceleration system will make a recommendation regarding the match. And if a student has, like, say, 75th percentile performance on achievement tests, it's not going to be considered a good match. What the integrated acceleration system will say is reevaluate this at a later date when you have more data. If the student has high average performance, whether they have a twice exceptionality or not, they're not going to be considered a good match. You don't want students to be unnecessarily frustrated, whether they have an exceptionality or not. You want them to be challenged and engaged. And that's kind of the best indicator. If they are really not challenged, then you want to look deeper into that.
Yes. And I think that's something that I end up having conversations with families of students who are wanting to enter kinder or first grade early, but their data does not support that. And fortunately, in Colorado, we have our state law that really outlines what the data set has to look like. But the conversation is around the response is not right now. It doesn't mean your student will never be whole grade accelerated, but not right now, not today. And we can absolutely evaluate in the next school year and the school years beyond. And so for parents not to think that it's such a permanent answer for those youngest students, if they're not ready right now, it doesn't mean that they never will be. But the door is still open. We can still revisit that in the future.
Exactly.
So I'm wondering, as we close up and just looking back at your career and your experiences, wondering what you're most proud of and really what are you hopeful for as you look in the future for gifted education?
Well, I'm most proud of all of the people who I've had the opportunity to work with and the ways that I hope that I've allowed them to shape me and directions that I've gone in. And I think that I've helped to shape some people too. And so I really like that dynamic interaction with individuals like yourself and former students, et cetera. So I think I'm really proud of that. And I do have a lot of patience, so I think that's good. But in terms of my hope for the future and what do I think about? Well, I'm an optimist by nature, and I'm very optimistic, and I'll tell you why. That is because we have marvelous young people and they have lots of opportunities, and educators are recognizing that you need to make these opportunities accessible. And so we have ways now of really bringing opportunities to schools and having schools more opportunities to have their kids be involved in talent development. So when I see young people, I think, okay, I'm going to be okay. They're smart and they have had good training. I think I'm just very optimistic based upon my experience with young people and the people who work with them and how awesome that is. It's energizing. That's why I loved working at the center. It was a very energizing, dynamic place.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your story and your experiences. I really enjoyed talking to you, getting to know you a little bit more. And I'd love to have you back
Likewise.
to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Well, anytime, Meryl, I would love to continue to be part of your conversation with other people. So thank you.
Thank you.
This episode of Exceptionally Speaking is brought to you by Hex 24 Press, where education meets imagination. I founded Hex 24 Press in 2024 to uplift educator voices and provide a publishing home for myself and other educators to bring our work into the world. You can find more information about today's guests, including links to their resources and services, at hex24press.com. Thank you for supporting educators, independent creators, and small business. We're so glad you're here.